welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by the author of an absolutely fascinating work of history blended with some memoir and family history. It is such a unique and interesting book, and I am so excited to talk about it. So welcome to the show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Sure. My name is Jeremy Jones. I'm a writer living in the mountains of North Carolina. And my forthcoming book, my most recent book, is called CIPHER, Decoding My Ancestors' Scandalous Secret Diaries, is the very long subtitle, which is, I think you've captured it well, a book about my fourth great grandfather's weird encoded diaries and how they sort of shape who I am or who I want to be today.
Can you start us off by talking a little bit about how these journals came into your life? Because you go into sort of their provenance, and the journals themselves have such a fascinating history beyond even what's contained in them.
Yeah, I mean, it was pure luck. There's this great, I don't know how true the story is, but Richard Hugo in his essay, Writing Off the Subject, or maybe The Triggering Town, he has this great collection of essays about writing. And he talks about Jack Nicklaus, the golfer, and the story is supposedly he had like hit the ball into the bunker and sort of was like lining up his shot. He's not in a good position. Somehow manages to chip it out and it goes in the hole. And the person in the peanut gallery says a little too loudly, "Oh, that was lucky." And Nicholas like turns to him and says, "It's true, but I find the more I practice, the luckier I get." And so I always tell students, and the thing that I try to practice is just being really curious and sort of open to the world, and then you get lucky. And I feel like the discovery for me of these diaries was pure luck. So for me, I was just looking for photographs in some boxes at my grandma's house, which is risky, right? If you're going to go through boxes in your grandma's house, you never know what you're going to turn up. And I found this, or she sort of pulled out and then gave to me this newspaper clipping from 1978, which told the story of the discovery of the diaries. And that was pure sort of accident too. Someone just found them in an abandoned house in 1975. But really, the diarist had been dead since 1859. So somehow they had survived, moved about 100 miles from where he died, landed in this house that was about to be demolished. And this man found them. And that wasn't enough because they were written in code and he had no idea what they were. And so he just sort of opened these really old hand-sewn notebooks and knew that they looked strange but old, and then spent a lot of time, I mean, really 3 years off and on, going to historical societies and librarians and archivists and saying, "What is this?" And a lot of people said, "I don't know." And then he just kept asking for some reason until they eventually landed in the hands of a retired NSA cryptanalyst who had spent, his career breaking codes for the government. And for him, it was kind of T-ball. I think he broke the code in like 30 minutes, just by looking at a few pages. But it's this winding story that could have easily ended 1,000 different ways in the diaries being lost, but somehow they survived. And then I found out about them really about 10 years ago.
Wow. It is an incredible amount of luck and contingency just for them to survive 100 plus years, then be picked up by somebody who didn't throw them out, who actually got emotionally invested in them and got them
Right.
decoded. It's extraordinarily fascinating. And so could you talk a little bit about the author of these diaries, William, and your relation to him?
Yeah, so he is my fourth great grandfather, which is not something I believed when I first found them. My grandma gave me this newspaper clipping, which did tell a little bit of the story I just told, which is how they were discovered. But really, the framing of that newspaper article was about how William Prestwood, the diarist, had been a philanderer and had had so many affairs all across the region. So that's the newspaper article I read and was like, "Cool, Grandma, thank you for bringing this to my attention." And then she told me that the man had been her great great grandfather. And I'll admit that I did not believe her. She was older. I was, trying to put myself in position to find random things. So I had been digging around in family history for a while, and she had never mentioned this man. But of course, she was right. So he's my fourth great grandfather. And he was, he did have a lot of sexual affairs, but he was much more complicated and interesting than that. Um, I think on paper, he was a teacher and a surveyor for most of his life. He came from a kind of planter class status, so he had been educated and could read Greek and Latin, but for some reason left his family and moved to the mountains and started teaching. Um, he was just curious about the world. He spent a lot of time dissecting animals and charting bird migrations, and he has all these mathematical equations trying to calculate the orbit of the different planets. Someone who was just sort of always asking questions about the world, and was also problematic like any other person is at any point in time, but especially for us looking back on the 19th century, living in a antebellum South.
Mm. Yeah, there's a really interesting dichotomy with him where he's often referred to in your text and by others writing about him as sort of like an everyman, so he
Hmm.
sort of like represents like the human experience in some way, but also he is such a unique and distinct personality as well. He is utterly fascinating, and as you've been saying, he like defies easy categorization, and I
Hmm.
that reminds me of something that my history professor once told me is that like it's very natural for us to want to go back and look at historical figures and be like, oh, this was a good person, this was a bad person, but like that doesn't tell us anything about history or about the person, and it makes it more.
Or about us, I think for me, the venture was like, I want to learn about me by learning about this man. But if he falls into an easy category, then that doesn't really translate into any actionable, sort of information for me, because it just lets me know like, oh, I come from a good person or I come from a bad person. But in some ways, like that complication is what creates opportunities to think about like what does this mean for what I do with my life or how I live my life.
Mm. Absolutely. Could you talk a little bit about, a little bit more detail about that story? You've talked a little bit about his observations, his sort of, if you want to call them like scientific experiments or observations, his personal life, which was very dynamic and interesting. Was there anything in there that really surprised you or that sort of made you reconsider that family history or your view of your family's place in the world?
I mean, four-letter words were a lot of the surprising things.
Yeah.
I just didn't know there were like words that, we see as pretty obscene now, that maybe were pretty obscene then too, but that he was using, in very direct, often anatomical ways. So that was kind of surprising. I think I do come from family land, and so I knew two of my great grandmothers. The house for my great great grandparents is still on our land. And so I did feel like I had a sense of family history that was deeper, maybe, than like the average American. And that sense of family was generally pretty like quiet, these like subsistence farmers who started the Methodist Church and didn't drink. And so finding this like, ladies' man in the 19th century who's needs a lot of like censor bars across his diary was surprising a little bit to me, I think, just because I thought, uh, I don't know, I sort of imagined that the people I knew and the stories I heard had come down in a really linear way, and that wasn't true. So I think, yeah, um, his wild oat sowing was surprising in some ways. I also think that he you know, I think that it's obvious a little bit now, but it was surprising to me to look back at someone, so long ago, 200 years ago. And here I am as a writer and a teacher, and I'm like, oh, I wonder how I'm connected to this man. Oh, he was a writer and a teacher too. And so finding that kind of like through line of teaching from generation to generation was kind of fascinating for me too.
It is really nice. That's a nice little bit of continuity over history. And I think you're
Although I
Mhm.
will like immediately upset that and say that there is like one written account of him as a teacher from one of his former students who says that all that he ever did was sit around and eat turnips and sleep and let the children do whatever they want. So he may not have been like the best teacher, but at least he was trying.
Kind of like after tenure, probably,
Right, 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 right. Yeah.
Um, yeah, it's really, really interesting to me how reading, a historical source like this, that for me as a reader, it's so easy to get like resensitized to like the times expectations, if that makes sense. Because now like I could turn on I don't know, like a Guy Ritchie or a Martin Scorsese movie and hear a million four-letter words in 90 seconds and not bat an eye. But reading some of the words in this diary from like the mid 19th century, I was like, oh my, like,
I
getting
know.
papers about it. Like it was just really
Right.
interesting how easy it is to get immersed in the time period that he's living in while you're reading uh,
Yeah.
the excerpts.
Yeah, I just read a few months ago this really great novel called The Ministry of Time. Have you read that yet? The
Yes.
Callie Ann Bradley novel, which obviously I loved because the whole setup is like the character bringing a 19th century man into the current moment and like having to have conversations with him. But in the same kind of way, I think that was fascinating for me, like thinking about those sensibilities and what happens when they merge, and her looking back and assuming these things about a 19th century man that weren't necessarily true to. And so, yeah, people were still people. And that's so obvious, but so easy, I think, to forget when you're doing historical research, at least for me.
Absolutely. Yeah, I tend to see the differences first, and then once you sort of like are accustomed to like the perceived weirdness, you can sort of see what is familiar, and what
Yeah,
is
yeah.
the human. Um, I'd love if you could talk a little bit about weaving your story and your family's story into his. Did you write them in tandem, or did you write them separately and then interweave them? Because it really does have this really lovely rhythm to it that is like sometimes sort of stream of conscious, because you'll go off a topic that he was talking about in the diary and then relate that to something in your experience. So how different does like the first draft look from, what's in the book now?
I mean, I think I said earlier that I found these diaries about 10 years ago, so that gives you some sense of how efficient I was at figuring out how to make the book work. It's taken a while. Um, I tried a lot of different ways. I think I always knew that I wanted the story to be nonfiction, and I felt like I needed to be a piece of it. When I first found the diaries, my agent at the time said, "Oh, great, you should use this material for a novel. Like you've got all this really rich material you can pull on." And that makes sense in some ways, but I was really interested in the quirkiness of his life, and like almost the syncopation of his entries were sometimes like poetic and surprising. And I didn't want to lose that by just fictionalizing it. So I tried a lot of different ways. Originally, the first draft of the book was actually this long epistolary form where I was writing a letter to him, and that didn't really work. And I think that in some ways the merging of our two stories felt natural because when I discovered the diaries, we were about to have our first kid, and life just felt really, there was like this sort of turning point of me looking back and looking forward. And then he arrives, the diarist. And so it felt like those stories went together. I think as a writer, I tend to sort of move by feel. I know that like these things are connected, but I'm not really sure how. And so what I tend to do is I'm a very kind of visual person in terms of processing. And I was telling someone this story recently, but I had an office space where I wrote, and I had white papers all over the walls and had sort of written things, and I was connecting them and drawing lines and like had pictures up on the wall. Nobody ever went into this room because it was just this office space in a shared office building. And then COVID hit and I stopped going in. And I had to go back in like a year later. And there was a note on the door from the fire marshal who had to go into the office while I was gone. And I immediately thought, like, oh no, I'm on some like government watch list now. Because to walk into that room, it just looked like, like a conspiracy theorist's kind of lair.
Yeah.
But I think that's how I had to make sense of it. I had to just start putting things up and thinking, like, this feels like it connects to this. And then I would just sort of write into that felt connection and fail over and over and over. So I had kind of mapped out the sections eventually, and started figuring out kind of how to move back and forth between the two. I had in mind this like double helix because the book does talk a bit about DNA as a kind of like analogous structure. I'm sort of moving from his story to mine, and they're being interwoven, but I'm not sure how well that works. But that was what I was kind of keeping in mind.
Nice. Yeah, I really like that. And I think that does work. I'm curious about As you read more about him, as you interwove your story into his, did your image of him or your feelings about him change over the course of the writing? Like, how did you feel about his story at the end as opposed to the...
Mm,
Mm,
yeah. I mean, I think if it probably feels a little silly to say out loud how much emotional investment I had in this man who's been dead for, over 150 years, but there was a lot of up and down. I think that reading the diaries chronologically, so they start when he's 20 and go until, his early 70s. And so I sort of saw him as a child when he's chasing women and trying to like settle down and keeps getting rejected by this woman he wants to marry. And I think it was easy to pat him on the head in those kind of sections. But as he got older and got married and then, like later is having affairs, I was not his biggest fan. I mean, it felt like he was letting his family down. It was easy to be kind of discouraged by him. And I think, the other big piece of this that I write about in the book is that he has a really complicated relationship with the industry of, slavery in the South. And it was easy to see these moments where it felt like he was beyond his time and he's like hiding escaped enslaved men on the run. And then these other moments where he feels like he's just as much complicit in the evil of slavery. So there were a lot of ups and downs there too. I think in the end, though, I mean, I came to see him just as a person who I think was like trying to make his way. And what that meant for him were some pretty hard decisions. I mean, he left all of his family wealth and land to move away, and I don't really know why, but he did and started over. He had children, he and his wife lost children along the way. Like there are all these hardships. And I came to see him as someone who was just trying to live, trying to make a way for himself for better or worse. And so I don't think that I, you know, um, villainized him in the end, but he's not fully lionized either. I think he's just a man who was trying, and I can respect that and kind of see him for that.
yeah. Absolutely. Like not ahead of his time, not behind his time, but of his time. And, trying to resolve a person's contradictions, inner contradictions, doesn't get any easier whether they're alive or dead. So I feel like just sort of letting
Right.
that contradiction sit gives you like this very full portrait of not just him, but his community, the people he interacted with. It's really a fascinating glimpse into this other time and place.
Yeah, and I think the fact that these are diaries that he never intended anyone to read provides a kind of weird insight into that contradiction too, because I didn't obviously get to see him living his life, but I got to see his um sort of perspective of what that lived life looks like. Like this is what happened today from his perspective. And so everything is wrapped up in that, which I think makes it even more complicated and messy. But I think that, yeah, you're right. That contradiction is, that's what's in our hearts. And so that's kind of where he's going to live, forever, and where he lived when he was living.
Absolutely. So, what are you working on now? Are you writing anything at the moment?
Yeah, I am working on a novel, I think. I don't, both my books have been nonfiction, and I don't really know that I know how to write a novel. It's a very different process from the whiteboard, murder board process that I was talking about earlier. Um, like I think there's supposed to be a plot in a novel, I'm realizing, I'm like, oh, nothing's happening. But I am kind of working on a novel that I think I'll get through a draft of in the next few months. And then just working on a lot of smaller essays, but really the novel's the big project.
Nice. Well, happy writing, Godspeed, and thank you
Thank
for
you.
taking the time out of your schedule to talk about this book with us. I think it's going to be a really popular one with our patrons. 'Cause it's just such an interesting story about your family and about like a time and a place that like seems very different from where we are in New York. So it's
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
thank you.
Well, thanks so much for reading it and thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no problem. Listeners, it's your turn now. Please check out CIPHER, Decoding My Ancestors' Scandalous Secret Diaries. It is available as of the time that you are hearing this podcast. So please head to your favorite bookstore, library, website, wherever you like to go for books. Do you have a place you like to send people for books or?
I mean, Bookshop is always easy, bookshop.org, but Malaprops is my local independent bookstore if you want to order from there in Asheville.
Excellent. Love that. I love a local bookstore. So yeah, thank you. Thank you for listening, everybody. It is time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.